book before I finished my first book. And I didn't really think I was going to finish my first book, actually.
Which was called Love Marriage.
Which was called Love Marriage, and which came out in 2008. And I had gone to my MFA program with a draft of that and kind of workshopped it and then put it away, and then got interested in a little bit of research, which sort of relates to a scene fairly late in the book, related to a hunger strike. And
wait, I don't mean to interrupt, but I read that you wrote the first part of this novel spring of 2004 after kind of stumbling into an intriguing bit of research the previous year. Is the hunger strike the bit of research? I was wondering what it was.
The hunger strike is the bit of research.
Okay.
And it was a hunger strike that took place on a stage outside a temple. And it was so extraordinarily theatrical. Every version of it that I read, and in every history that I could find, and every time I talked to someone who, I'd talked to people who had been there, and I couldn't stop thinking about that particular circumstance because it seemed so strange. I mean, it was because of the juxtaposition of the temple and the hunger strike and militancy, all of which might seem to be unlikely bedfellows, but I think really actually probably weren't. And so then also people's different views of how that story had gone, some of which is alluded to in the book. And so I was curious about what I could do with that. And I also knew that I couldn't shoehorn it into that first book. That would have made it very kitchen sink feeling. And so I felt like it was probably something else. And I guess this has been successful for me a number of times. I ended up writing about it for a specific occasion, which was that I wanted to get into a class that I hadn't registered for, which was a novella class that Ethan Kanan was teaching at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And I hadn't registered for it because I thought, I'm not interested in the novella. And that was actually not a good way to make that choice. And so I decided I did want to be in the class. All of my friends had made smarter decisions than me and were taking the class. And it was full. So I went to Ethan and I said, if you let me in the class, I volunteer to go first. And I had no novella. And he said yes. And I didn't end up with a novella. I did end up with a pretty long short story, which was The Hunger Strike. And that was the first bit of it. And then the class was just really encouraging. And that was sort of the beginning of writing the novel.
So your novel is about the Sri Lankan Civil War, or that is the backdrop, and we learn about its complexities through the lives of a particular family. The Kalentrins, I think, is the way you might pronounce it, but forgive me if I'm messing it up.
It's Kalandrin, yeah.
Okay, Kalandrin. So the protagonist of this book, whom I love, is named Sashi. Mm-hmm. And she is our narrator. She is the only daughter in a family of five children,
yeah.
Yeah. So she's the baby girl, or almost the baby in a family, and she's got 4 brothers. And she lives in the town of Jaffna, mm-hmm. which is, I believe, in North Sri Lanka. Is that right?
Yeah, it's northern Sri Lanka, and it's a Tamil dominated city.
Okay. So, but this family and Sashi's experiences in particular are the vehicle through which you explore this war and the impacts that it has on the lives of ordinary people, which is, I know from poking around a little bit in interviews that you've done, this was the mission, right? Is to try to investigate how these kinds of events impact regular people and how the histories of regular people often never see the light of day. There's kind of like a Howard Zinn-like impulse here, right? Well, because it's so true, right? We go through all of our schooling, and we take history classes, and we read works of history. And what's the old saying? Like, history is usually told by the winners.
Yeah.
And it's usually couched, in vantage points that favor elites and all this kind of stuff. And in this book, we really get like a human tour, if that's a way of putting it, of what was happening on the ground in Sri Lanka during these times. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit about that impulse and like how you arrived at it and what maybe some particular challenges were in trying to render it.
In thinking about what I wanted to do with the book, I did know that I was kind of writing against a history of propaganda, because it's also a book that's about the pressure of nationalism. And in Sri Lanka, I was talking earlier about Tamil nationalism, and there's also Sinhalese nationalism, Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. And so I was writing against the narratives put forward by the state, which are often quite nationalist, Sinhala Buddhist nationalist, and then the Tamil nationalist narratives that had been put forward by certain strands of the Tamil community. And those were stories that erased a lot of people. And if you diverged from those narratives, there were sometimes really serious consequences. So around the time that I had that access to the information about the hunger strike, I was also given, and I guess I have it here, and since there's video, I can use it as a little prop. I was given a copy of a book called The Broken Palmyra, and The Broken Palmyra is kind of a human rights classic. It's a nonfiction book that was written by 4 professors at the University of Jaffna who were not trained in kind of anything like that of human rights documentation, and so they kind of taught themselves to do it. And I have a copy now. The copy I was given then was on loan. And then I did eventually get my own copy, which you can see I keep in bubble wrap.
It's a rare book. It's
a rare
right?
book. It's a rare book.
There it is.
And when I was in graduate school at Iowa, or no, actually maybe it was a bit later. I was looking for a used copy online, and I found one that was like $30. I was amazed, actually, because not that many physical copies of it were printed, and most of the ones I'd seen were from university libraries. And it turned out that someone who had been the ambassador to Sri Lanka had died, and he'd had a copy of it, and all of these books about Sri Lanka. And a huge number of his books were at this used bookstore in the Detroit area. And they had this. And this book is like probably like $200 or maybe more. And I, as a graduate student or whenever it was that I got this, probably couldn't have afforded that. And so I lucked into this copy that has these annotations from the ambassador also.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, so like I had this earlier copy, and that's what this book does. It's really kind of obsessed with documenting the cost for ordinary civilians of this conflict, which went from, and I said when it started, 1983 approximately, but there's ethnic tension kind of before that, leading up to 1983. And my book starts in 1981. And then my book kind of ends in like 1989, 1990, in the early part of the war, and then skips ahead to the very end in 2009. So the back end of the war is not in there, in part because just sort of civilian toll and involvement in that period of time was different. But so this book was my model for kind of like, what happened to ordinary people if this is like a militarized society, like all of a sudden your teenage son leaves the house and like goes to another country and receives arms training. Then he comes back to your town, and he's somewhere pretty close by. You're maybe not exactly sure where. Maybe he'll show up again. Maybe he won't. What does that feel like if people come and want your house for military purposes, right? Like there's other kinds of eminent domain. I think we're familiar with the costs of that for some minority communities in the United States, like predominantly, I think the Black community, like in Minneapolis, like the highway, right? I mean, the seizure of land is a way of, yeah. Anyway, so like a lot of the book is about displacement. Some of it is about displacement, like just sort of the feeling that you might not be in your house at the moment that you thought you would be, that you might be asked to leave. Suddenly you might be in someone else's space that they were asked to vacate. Your ordinary things that you had in your ordinary life might become precious in a way that you hadn't anticipated.
Well, and I should say a lot of the things that you're describing are depicted in the book and impact the family at the heart of the book. So having sons who, as teenagers, leave the family, go off, become militarized, change pretty dramatically. I don't want to spoil too much, but there is tragedy and loss in this book in great measure. The war obviously takes lives, and there's also displacement. So all of these things come into play. And I think now might be a good time to have you just read a little bit from
Sure.
the book, because this novel is so excellent at humanizing the costs of war and the complexities of war and the ways in which war changes people, changes families so tragically. So I'll just have you kind of introduce this little section that I'm going to have you read, and then have you read it and we can discuss.
Sure. So the section that I'm going to read is a little bit, maybe almost a third of the way into the book. And it's at a point at which the brothers are starting to have different choices about what they might do in response to political events and tragic incidents. They're having different reactions to those things, as people have different reactions to tragedy. And so our protagonist, Sashi, is having a conversation with her next oldest brother, Seelan, who's just like about a year older than her, and they don't get along that well. They kind of have very different personalities. So her brother is thinking of going to India to train with Tamil militants, and that was where they were training at that time. And she's just realizing that a lot of the other boys kind of around her might be considering the same decision, including their friend Kay, who's another teenage boy who kind of lives down the road and is friends with her brothers. And so, and they're also, I guess there is, they're reacting also to a tragic incident that I won't spoil. Or no, I guess it's, never mind, I will spoil it. It's right in the passage. It's interesting actually, because some of the reviews mention this and others don't. And
Right.
I can imagine that you would feel like you were in a bit of a pickle, like trying to decide. I never really know whether I'm going to talk about it. It's always a game time decision. Anyway, the oldest brother dies, Niranjan, and he's kind of the one that everyone loved without condition. He was almost like a second father. Sashi wants to be a doctor, and he was a doctor. And so they're all having, that's the tragic incident, they're all having different reactions to. So I did not want him to go, and I did not want Kay to go, and I wished I could go too. I was as angry as them. Niranjan's death had devastated all of us. After my grandmother left, we became unable to talk to each other, perhaps because we had nothing to say except to blame each other and ourselves for what had happened. On some mornings, I woke up wanting to shriek at my father for sending us to Colombo. And I'll just break in here briefly to say Sashi's oldest brother, Niranjan, has been killed in the 1983 anti-Tamil riots that are basically considered the beginning of the war. But now, Appa stayed at his outstation post on days when he would have normally come home. My mother strayed towards the borders of madness, speaking not to us, but to herself. Aaron turned contemplative. Dylan drew and redrew the library, and Seelan was simply, quietly, constantly enraged. He did very little to express this, but even the smallest motions he made, pouring a cup of tea, turning a page, gave the impression of barely contained tremors. I missed the days of his casual temper. Our anger, which had nowhere to go, filled the space where Niranjan had been. I did not want Seelan to go, because I could not bear the thought of losing another brother. I did not want him to go because I needed his anger beside mine. I wanted him to go because if I could not have revenge, I thought he should. If you're going to go, I said, and then stopped. I don't need you to stay. Do what you want. You always have. But if you are going to go, tell me before you leave. It took the government and the tigers together to make our lives so small. I remember how my 3 remaining brothers, who loved music and art and libraries and school, became quieter as the call of militancy grew louder. their jokes dried up, as though politics had sapped all their humor. As siblings, we had cupped our hands around those tiny flames of shared laughter, the intimacies of family habits and histories. But then the lights winked out across the peninsula as boy after boy I had known and loved was extinguished or gone.
So that short passage to me captures so much of the grief and tragedy and the complex pressures that are brought to bear by the Civil War, by any war, really. And it all happens inside of one family. All of this anger, like that line about how the anger goes where Niranjan had been, like that feels really emotionally true to me and kind of devastating. And I also think about the ways that each human being processes these things differently. We all react to grief differently. We all have different politics. Even if we mostly agree, we all have different politics and ways of responding, especially in times like these where, you know, the politics of the time, it's like living in a kind of crucible, right? The stakes are so high. The decisions we make and the opinions we cultivate seem to have so much more import than they might during peacetime or more quote unquote normal times. So I just thought that that passage kind of gave a window into the human cost, which is not small.
Yeah. I think that might have been, especially that line about the family habits and intimacies might have been one of the earlier ones I had written. It ended up being a pretty big surprise to me that the book ended up being about a family when I had started with the hunger strike, because I hadn't initially thought of that. And it seems to be a lot of what people are responding to, and also accurate to the way that at least the stories that I heard from people about their family members having very different reactions, taking different paths in response to these major ruptures in their lives.
Well, it's a pretty big canvas that you're painting on. So, like from a writerly perspective, the challenge that you gave yourself is not a small one. You know, kind of joked earlier about having to try to summarize a civil, you know, like a 40-year civil war in a, you know, a soundbite or whatever. But to even to write a novel about this thing and to find a way in and to try to depict what it was like for ordinary people, even at, you know, 90,000 words or whatever, that's a huge challenge. And I think the decision that you made to go inside of one family primarily and to explore the impacts on it as a way of, um, I don't know, giving like an emblematic experience and an experience of a family that is emblematic of experiences that were happening all over Sri Lanka. That's as good a way as any. I mean, right? I mean, what else are you going to do? Like, unless you take like the third person omniscient perspective and just start, you know, that's even harder, right?
Yeah, I think certainly in relation to this war, I would be particularly hesitant to assume that point of view, which suggests an authority that Sashi herself is always kind of, there are various points in the book where she's kind of cranky about explaining things, but she does explain them. So it's like a little bit of a way to have my cake and eat it too. Like, here's the boilerplate that you need to know. And also here's this character who's like, you want your explanations. Fine.
Right.
So
Wait, are you talking about the little asides where she breaks out into the second person?
yeah.
That was directed at me, right? Especially like a reader like me. I
mean,
can feel that.
She's also cranky. I mean, she's cranky at herself. You know, she's sort of like, I mean, and I think it's, you know, it's how it's the dilemma, right? And like I do go on podcasts and try to summarize the Sri Lankan Civil War in 30 seconds, and it's for all sorts of reasons. Like, we live in a real world. It's a question I'm going to get asked. That means that I've actually practiced the answer. It also means that I somehow am still mucking it up such that I have to footnote myself.
Right.
You know, and then also, I don't know, like, I could have memorized a 30-second explanation that I just say the same way every time. Then here is also
just
like,
write it on your hand, you know, just
I'm gonna get a little tattoo. Actually, it would be a very long forearm tattoo, and I'll just start like looking down. But yeah, I mean, it's also like I had done this for my first book, and then I was like, wait, can I just like take a page from Love Marriage and stick it in there, and will anyone notice? And I was like, I'm not gonna get away with that.
Well, I think that Sashi is such a great character, such a winning heroine. And she's a great, like, I don't want to, I mean, I guess proxy for most readers, I would hope, like readers who are open to the complexity of war and the like incredibly difficult moral choices that people are faced with, ordinary people are faced with, that would not be easy for anybody. She brought me into contact with those kinds of choices and made things that could otherwise be simplified in media or in the press. She made those things much more dimensional and complex, and, you know, kind of made all sides of this thing feel human. And at the same time, I think that there is something in her life story and her professional ambitions as a doctor, and the fact that she's a young child going through school when this thing starts. And, you know, the part of the success of this novel has to do with, I think, the reader worrying about whether or not she's going to get there and how is she going to make her way through this thing. You know, obviously there's a huge cost to this war absorbed by young men who did most of the fighting, but there's also huge costs borne by the mothers at home, the young girls whose educations were either ended or curtailed or interrupted. And so, I don't know, that choice to sort of make Sashi the center of it and her life story to be a big part of it, like not the war part, though that is a part of it, but just is she going to get to be a doctor? You know, I was rooting for her so hard. She's a lovely character.
Thank you. That's nice to hear. I hadn't really thought about it in quite this way before, but I guess, right, if you're telling a story about a war and you tell it in third person omniscient, then anyone could die. And if you tell it in first person, then that person's going to survive. And certainly this is a heavily retrospective narration. So maybe it was another way of creating suspense. Right, like another big desire beyond just survival.
Wow. And I think too, like, just her particular consciousness and viewpoint and sense of morality and her keen intelligence, she's a great way in for readers to sort of examine these things and to experience them firsthand, because she doesn't take the easy way. You know, she's not super reactive or hot-headed. She's a cool customer, you know, and she's very bright and she's big-hearted. And these things aren't simple, right? I mean, you talked earlier about the Broken Palmyra, and just so I'm clear, is the Broken Palmyra, was that the one that was written by the University of Jaffna professors, or is that different?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, because like one thing that popped up for me when I was thinking about this book and thinking about Sashi, and in particular thinking about Anjali Premachandran, the university professor character in the book, who I believe is based on a real figure named Rajani
Thiranagama. Yeah.
Thiranagama. Yeah. Okay. So there were these university professors who were collecting these histories and trying to document the impacts of this war on real people, and who understood its complexity and the way that, you know, to make it a binary thing where it's just good versus bad or Tamil versus Sinhalese, you know, that's not the whole story. And I think that these people were trying to tell it in its complexity and were resisting and wanting peace. It reminded me of the Vietnam War and the School for Youth and Social Service, I think it was called. I just know about this. It was like a Buddhist student group organized, I think, and founded by Thich Nhat Hanh and his, you know, friends in the Buddhist community. But it was kind of functioning in a similar way, to try to advocate for peace and to resist and to tell these stories and to really not take sides in a very explicit or militarized way.
It should have occurred to me actually to look for a Vietnamese, like a counterpart, since I've heard that metaphor so many times, and it has never occurred to me to look. And so now I will go and look that up, which is great.
Well, yeah, there's always in a conflict like this, especially a civil war, there's always going to be so many people who are resisting and unsure and trying to maintain their humanity. You know, it can be difficult to do when things get this dark.
Yeah, and yet there were always people, you know, during this period of time, people were doing all of the things that they normally do. They were studying and taking exams when university was open. They were falling in love, and they were going to after-school clubs and putting on plays. Yeah, I mean, all of those things were still happening. And so, I mean, it is also, the book is set in Jaffna, and that's not unprecedented, but it's not the most common choice for a setting in fiction set in Sri Lanka. A lot of fiction is set in Colombo. There have been a couple of books sort of set in specific regions associated with the war. But Jaffna in particular, people sometimes, including within Sri Lanka, kind of talk about it as though it's other. And to me, it's very familiar territory. And so I think I wanted also to kind of show the ways that it was very alive in this period.
So wait, and we should talk a little bit about your like heritage and personal history. Do you have family from Jaffna?
I do.
You do, okay. And you are, I wrote this down. You are of Ilankai Tamil heritage.
Yeah, I'm specifically using that's like a political choice. So it's Ilanke Tamil heritage, and so I think that's probably from my Wikipedia entry or something like that, or maybe my website.
Uh,
But I'm choosing that word because there are some people who are like, I'm a diasporic person, and often when people talk about the Tamil diaspora, they actually mean the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora specifically. People don't really use that term in the same way for, say, folks whose parents are from India. But there are lots of people in the Tamil diaspora who won't identify as Sri Lankan because they have a lot of sympathy for Tamil nationalism. And so they'll say that they're from Olam or something like that, which was really like a term associated with separatism, for example. So, but then the country name Sri Lanka is also controversial, like particularly the Sri. And so, like, me picking this way of identifying myself is like a way of saying that I consider myself Sri Lankan, but I'm doing it in Tamil. So it's like you'd have to, like, there's all of this code, right? Like, there's all of this, like, I'm really happy that the book is educational for people. It's funny because I think that, like, there's a lot of code built into the book that if you do know the terrain, like, some people will get, like, that there are other meanings to some of these things. So anyway, like, if there were, yeah, I wish that there were a shorter way to explain that too.
right. Well, no, but it's good. I mean, it's good to know. It makes sense to me. And you mentioned that you, are part of the diaspora. You're writing from the diaspora, which you
Mm-hmm.
wrote a lovely essay about on LitHub, the
Mm-hmm.
website,
Thank you.
which I found it contextualized things and it added maybe a dimension to the read for me. But I want to talk to you about that because I hadn't thought of it until I read what you had to say. I was like, oh, wow. So, yeah, she's writing this novel from outside, and maybe that comes with its own set of challenges and criticisms that people might levy, because you weren't necessarily on the ground in the midst of all this. And just, I think it's less about the politics of it and more about the creative responsibilities. I think that's the part of it that I'm interested in, is to take something on like this and to try to do it justice. That's the big challenge, right? And can you just talk a little bit about how you navigated this issue of writing from the diaspora?
Sure. So I wrote about it in this essay for LitHub, in which I kind of was talking about, right, as a diasporic person, people sometimes, if they're not Sri Lankan or connected to any Sri Lankan community of any ethnicity, people will give me a lot of authority to talk about Sri Lanka. And I think this is true of any person with clear and strong ties to another place. Like I would trust instinctively, say, a Greek American person to know more about Greece than I would, right? But there's also, I don't know, I found that the amount of authority that I was sometimes given was like beyond what I felt I deserved. In fact, that was like pretty common. And then on the other hand, kind of there's another constituency that will kind of write off the idea that I might have anything to say or that I should say anything at all because I am just diasporic and I grew up outside the country. And I think just sort of as an artist, I think politically, I can't kind of countenance that. So, and I also just don't like being told that I shouldn't do things. I think I'm probably like pretty square in a lot of ways, but like a pretty solid way to get me to do things is to tell me that I shouldn't do them. Like I will 100% end up doing that thing. I must have been a child parented with a lot of reverse psychology. But so I think, I'd had a lot of people tell me, or I had sort of heard a lot of people say that like the Tamil diaspora kind of has no business. And it's also true that the Tamil diaspora was responsible in many ways for financial support for the Tigers. And there's like political baggage that's attending the idea that I shouldn't say anything, like, people who emigrated by and large in a certain period coming from more privilege, economic privilege, caste privilege, educational privilege, all kinds of privilege, the privilege to leave. And then some of those people sending back money for other people's children to die. Right. Which is, that was the critique. And I think a lot of that was valid. So then I think also, I was writing historical fiction about a period of time. It's historical fiction, but it's like 1981. So it's not that long ago. So one of the advantages of like writing about a period of time that's that recent is that you have not just the library, you have the people who are alive, who were there. So you can talk to all of those people. You're also accountable to them. Like if you write about a period of time that's so far in the past, like, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln's not going to complain when you write a novel
Right.
in his perspective. Like he's not
Right.
gonna, go create a Reddit thread about hating you. So, so I think that it was a huge resource and also like an accountability thing for me. And I was in conversation with a lot of those people who were generous. And, as much as I think I wish that I were fluent enough in Tamil to say write in Tamil, I don't write in Tamil. I write in English. And to think about the ways that English is a Tamil language, also like many, many Tamil speakers also speak English. We're educated in English. Like, and I don't know, to think about that as a problem and like how to put that in the fiction. So like the book also, like one of the things it does is like note slippage between languages in some conversations. Like this is a part of the story where like they're speaking in Tamil because the conversation is so sensitive.
Right.
Or like
right.
this is a part where they're talking in English. I can't tell you the story in Tamil, but this is what was happening. So like that was some of the way that in the form I would kind of account for it. And then also that like cranky explaining, right? Like that's a diasporic problem. Like, oh, I've suddenly become the spokesperson. That's fun.
Uh-huh. Well, there's a line from the essay, I believe, where you say, quote, as some people acknowledge hierarchies of grief, others consider hierarchies of authenticity. But Americans, particularly those from dominant communities, are often not very good readers of hierarchies of authenticity, believing them to be simpler than they are. So this is kind of a related point, I think, right? Where you're the diasporic author and people are often looking to you to sort of parse this stuff. But, I think America in general has no idea what's going on in other places in the world, but then might, see a movie or read a book and suddenly start jabbering with all this authority. Like, I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think a lot of my own beefs on this point have to do with, I don't know, it's like Americans sometimes are really slow to remember that other countries might have minority populations. I'm like, where did you think, I don't know, did you think that it was just homogenous? And I don't know, like it's a miniaturization of imagining that I don't think, I mean, I am a minority from, or my parents are ethnic minorities in the country that they emigrated from, and I am a minority here. And so even like in an American context, if I talk about Sri Lanka, like I am not talking from the point of view of a diasporic person of the dominant ethnicity. And then of course there's also, I mean, I have friends who are of mixed ethnic heritage, and that's very common. That's also a thing that people sometimes can't like, their imaginations don't go that far. And so, my friends who do have, and, I have relatives who are of mixed ethnic heritage and speak multiple languages, and that's also very common. So like all of that was like, I didn't want to sort of make it like token representation. I did want Tamil people in Jaffna to be the center of the book. But there are, for example, like there's a pretty important Muslim character in the book, who I feel very fond of. And there's a couple in the book that have like a brief but pivotal role, and they're Sinhalese and Tamil, and they're married and they have a kid, and she doesn't regard them as unusual, and she doesn't like take a lot of time to explain them necessarily, but they're there. And she, I think also that sometimes like when Americans read other countries, those countries are flattened down to like one point. Like a novel, and I think I may have said this in the essay, I don't know, like there's so many, like a novel set in Beijing is not the same as one set in Shanghai.
Right.
We don't talk about them differently at all.
Well, it's a good point. And I think anybody who reads your book would have a hard time coming away being able to flatten Sri Lanka. I will say too, as an American reader, that something your book did, and I don't know if there was any intentionality in this from your perspective as the creator, but something I could not help but feel as I was reading about the Sri Lankan Civil War is I could not help but make some comparisons in my head to the political divisions and tensions and the violence, or the hints at violence, that we see in the United States right now. It's not the same, obviously. We haven't broken out into a civil war. But just this week, I want to say Marjorie Taylor Greene was calling for a national divorce and this sort of thing. And I sensed I guess it gave me maybe like a deep way to imagine what that kind of thing might be like should it unfold. Did America, I guess you've been writing this thing for so long, it's almost like America, caught up to you in a dark way. Do you know what I'm saying? Like things sort of deteriorated here as you were finishing the book, right? So I don't know. Did that ever occur to you, that sort of thing, or not
There
at
were
all?
moments. No. Especially late in the writing, 100%.
Yeah.
100%. And I think, I think that I'm probably not the first person to think of Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the president of Sri Lanka, and Donald Trump in kind of the same space in my mind. They occupy similar real estate in my brain. And then late in the writing of the book, George Floyd was murdered. I live in Minneapolis. And so I was in a place also where there were the uprisings. There was a lot of like civilian resistance to militarization of society. And that was important and powerful to see. And to see the different ways that people tried to help and contribute to that effort in people's different capacities and fears about participating in that. That was a strange and powerful, like a strange and really like important place for me, I think, to be writing in. So much has happened in the period of time that I've written this book, but that was one thing. I mean, that was a moment where, there are like choppers flying over Minneapolis, and there's like gas, and they're using all sorts of stuff on reporters. They're using it in different neighborhoods. There are people leaving their houses because, their children can smell things. And I'm just like, oh, and right now I'm writing a scene in which this happens.
Right.
This is strange.
Yeah. I feel like that happens. Sometimes writers can be kind of weather vanes or something. Like there's something, like I'm willing to believe that there is something deeper happening sometimes, where an author's work can be like unintentionally predictive or can be tuned into some frequency. It makes a certain sense to me when you're doing this much deep thinking and kind of meditating on something, that it might be because you're sensing it somehow, like coming down the line. I don't know. Do you know what I'm getting at? Like, I feel like it's not the only time I've had a conversation like this on this show. And I've had instances in my own writing where it won't be like super predictive, but you'll just find these weird synchronicities sometimes. Like sometimes it can be something from the past even, or you're discovering something in research that totally correlates with what you're doing that kind of freaks you out. You know what I'm talking about? Like,
Oh no, yeah, for sure.
yeah, I imagine
Like
you
I
probably
wanted, I guess the other thing that I would mention here, kind of in that line, is there's all this university stuff, and I teach at a university, and we are, of course, in a moment when education is under attack, and like, the things we assign to our students or what we say in classrooms, and surveillance has, like community surveillance, people who are parts of civil society surveilling each other, right? And that happens in the book, and that was definitely on my mind.
So I would just like to take a moment now to say hello to everyone who is surveilling us on this podcast. Well, welcome to the Otherppl show. Glad to have you. Thanks for the download numbers. But I want to talk to you about the word terrorist because this factors into your book. I know the New York Times review sort of focused on this to a pretty strong degree, but right at the beginning of the book, there's a great opening line, which of course I cannot repeat verbatim. Maybe you have it memorized or written on your little card. Do you have it?
I recently sent a letter to a terrorist I used to know.
Yeah, that's how the book opens. So great opening line. And, it's worth, while we're talking about like America's difficulties with reading other countries and cultures and surveillance and the sort of crazy media culture that we often have to deal with in this country. Like, this is another thing that your book does so well, is it takes a word like that and it refuses to simplify, right? It brings like that word into like the human realm as opposed to like what's the word for it? I'm thinking of like George Bush talking about like the axis of evil, like this binary way of thinking, this way of otherizing, this way of oversimplifying, this way of sort of drawing conflicts into, good versus evil, all these ways that, political leaders in particular, a certain kind of political leader or media figure will do as a way of ginning up support or getting ratings. And your book cuts against that, and I appreciated it for that.
Thank you. I mean, I do think, I hope that it also does that while being critical of the things the militants did, because, I mean, I think, there's, someone had said to me that, like, I want to talk about when people do things that are wrong. I don't like the word terrorism because it sort of is what it's trying to do is put people beyond the realm of discussion, like put what they want, what has happened to them. Then it doesn't matter. You can do anything you want to them. Like, it's suddenly right. Like, Sri Lanka has had a Prevention of Terrorism Act since like 1972, and it has been used to justify all sorts of, am I allowed to swear in your show?
Yeah, of course.
Terrible shit. Just fucking ridiculous shit. Like, they will just detain people and not say why, and then have them detained for interminable periods of time. And it's just a way, sometimes it's a way to punish people, and just, it's, disproportionately used against, you can guess who. And I think that, so in some ways, like, sometimes I would see things happen in the United States and be like, well, Sri Lanka's ahead of the curve on this one. And, I don't know. Like, I just think that, so I don't like that language. And someone had said that it was, and I don't remember who it was in all of the conversations that I had, but that it was maybe not right to talk about terrorism unless you were also going to talk about state terror, right? Like, terrorist is also used, it's almost used to cast someone beyond like, it means that you're no longer a civilian, and it means that the state is not accountable to you. Like, a civilian is someone that the state is accountable to. And so, like, they've cast you outside the realm of society, almost like you're not acceptable society, but they're never held to account. And like, governments are doing all sorts of things like that all the time, like the drones, like all of those unmanned killings of civilians. And so, like, but that's state terror, but we don't use that language. So if we're not going to use that language, then we have to find a different way to talk about this too, which doesn't mean that I think, like, right? There's also a number of instances in the book in which within the family, and beyond that as well, one of the things that people want to talk about and that the Tigers don't want them to talk about, among other people, among other Tamil militant groups, is the violence committed against civilians by the Tamil militants, who are, who in many cases were like, there's, this would be spoilers also, but just like, they're not always attacking combatants. So it isn't that I don't think that we should talk about that either. Like, it was really important to me that the critique of the Tigers that came out of civil society, that came out of Tamil civil society, the Tigers killed a lot of Tamil civilians. That was also...
The Tigers even killed each other. I mean, like, this is your book. Yeah. Your book is great on this. This is why I loved it so much, is that it's just like it draws into focus the chaos. Like, war is so chaotic, and it has nothing to do with binary thought.
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of that. It's like the fog of war, or whatever you want to call it. Like, it's just craziness. Human craziness is what war really is at its heart.
So it was, I think that first page was just like kind of a way to say, like, here's the language that you've been using, and I guess we'll start with that. But like, it's not going to suffice.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I think like it brought to mind for me too. I remember, like, I have these kind of like vague memories of the early aughts, and in the aftermath of 9/11. And I remember, I want to say it was Karl Rove sort of mocking people, I guess mostly people on the political left, who sought to quote unquote like understand the quote unquote enemy, as if that were somehow like a bad move, or like a mark of having like low character. Like, why did these people hate us? Like, so much that they would fly a plane into a building. You know what I'm saying? Like, just wanting to understand why it happened, to wanting to understand who these people were as human beings, not to condone anything, but just to sort of arrive at a deeper understanding so that we might be able to prevent these things, and so on and so forth. And that was just, to a certain kind of person, I guess that's just a sign of weakness or something. But I feel the opposite, and I feel like your book is the opposite of that impulse.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know, like, from a craft perspective, right? I don't know, like, if you were workshopping Karl Rove, you would be like, now you've created a way that, like, this entire set of characters has unintelligible motivations, and like, you want that for some reason. Like, you think that like their wants are just impenetrable.
Right. Yeah. Like, what a lazy approach.
Yeah.
So
try
anyway,
harder, Carl.
Yeah. Try. Good thing he's not a novelist, right? Or maybe he is. I don't know. Who knows? But these guys all have like a weird novel in their drawer somewhere. But
oh God. I hope not.
So the writing of this thing, we've talked, I think, a bit about this earlier, and we've sort of been touching on it as we go. Like, this is a big canvas that you're painting on, and you gave yourself a big task. And I know from my research that the plot of this book changed several times. The Sri Lankan Civil War itself ended in 2009. So, that has to impact the work that you're doing. That's when you were in the middle of it, at least in terms of the timeline, right? You wrote this for 20 years, and 2009 would be close to the middle. So can you just, like, from a writerly creative perspective, the endurance that it took you to finish this and to adjust on the fly and to accept that certain things weren't working? I would imagine you had to cut a lot of stuff and add other stuff in, and there might have been moments when you thought you were close to finishing and you actually weren't. Like, can you just talk about that?
Doesn't that happen with every book, even if you like
Yes, but I think a book like this,
yeah,
maybe more so, to get it right. Like, it is a beautifully plotted book. It is beautiful line by line.
Thank you.
And it just feels, to me anyway, like it just felt note perfect. And to get it, a story this big, into that form, I just have to believe required a lot of patience and just like endurance. Can you just talk about that part of it, the changes that it underwent, and maybe the emotional aspects of having to respond
Sure.
creatively?
Like definitely a lot of different things happened over this period of time, right? The Indian Ocean tsunami was close to the beginning of the writing of this book. And it ended up actually briefly in Love Marriage. Um, yeah, the Rajapaksas took power. The Easter bombings happened. All sorts of shifts in the war happened. There was a ceasefire. And I mean, particularly the ending of the war, which was like a thing that I hadn't really been able to conceive of. Like I had like my first conscious, like I think my first memory is like of something related to the war. And so like I didn't have an idea of how my mind even worked beyond that. And it was great. I mean, on one level, it was great to find out. And also the way that it came to a conclusion was really brutal. So I think that
How so? Just
well, towards the end, and Anukarud Pragasam wrote a novel that is kind of set in this period of time. There was after 9/11, the Rajapaksa family, and specifically Mahinda Rajapaksa, came to power in Sri Lanka, was elected on the strength of kind of a promise to crush the tigers. And they did that with like a pretty brutal military push, which towards the end of the war meant that a number of Tamil civilians were trapped between the tigers and Sri Lankan security forces. There was a no-fire zone, which was unilaterally declared by the Sri Lankan government. And then they also shelled parts of that. And Anukarud Pragasam's first novel, The Story of a Brief Marriage, is set in the no-fire zone. So like I think the plight of those civilians, I think, was on a lot of people's minds, and specifically Tamil diaspora people.
is this the scene in the book? I mean, I don't want to spoil too much, but this is the beach. Is that what you're talking about? Like the end of the war? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, I mean, there's a portion where, I mean, Sashi in 2009 is an ER physician in New York City, and the book starts with you knowing that, and towards the end of the book, you see her watching the end of the war from New York, and she is thinking about that space. So I think that like once the war had ended, it was impossible that the end of the war would not be in the book. But in terms of patience and endurance, like I don't know that I always exhibited that much.
Well, you did enough to make it through 20 years, so don't knock yourself too much.
Thanks. I mean, I think that there were a lot of people who like probably thought like, I mean, maybe it would have been smart for me to go to another project and come back to learn some of the things I needed to learn to do this. And instead, I just like really learned everything in the space of this book, like by messing up a lot, by throwing out hundreds of pages, as you mentioned. I felt myself at the beginning of writing this book to be a writer who was bad at plot. And that was something I both wanted to work on and something I felt was necessary for the story, because everyone I knew who had lived through this period, oh, I was fucking crammed with plot. Like people would be like, take that out. It's too much. Too much is happening. The pace is ridiculous. If someone had been like putting their life in workshop, you know, and that had happened to me actually. Like there was an early bit of this that I'd taken to workshop, and all four brothers died. So spoiler, that is not what happens in this book. But that is where the four brothers came from that sort of line that my subconscious gave me. And like I remember someone in the class sort of being like, maybe after class in a conversation being like, all four brothers die. Is that believable? And I was like, oh shit, it is. Like it definitely is.
Yeah.
And I don't know. So I kind of knew that like I would have to like my fear of plot was connected to a fear of like it's cause and effect, right? And once you make a choice, like then all of these other dominoes fall behind that. And then you're like maybe either in a great spot or like a wicked pickle. And I think for a long time, like really afraid of plotting the book. And
so, okay, let me just stop you, because I think so
Yeah.
many people who write literary fiction are quote unquote bad at plot. I've said this about myself. I've had similar aspirations where it's like, I want to get good at plot. I just talked to Rebecca Mackay on this show, and she's a literary writer who's great at plot. And
Yeah,
so I was like focusing on that with her. But like, what did you learn? Because this book is great on plot.
Thank you.
So like, you talked about, you were just talking about some of the stuff that you were doing and how, it's cause and effect and you make choices and then have to deal with those choices on the page. Is there anything else for listeners that you could point to, and for me, that you learned about plot, or like particular like lessons, or like blocks that you had, or you know what I'm saying? Like things that you previously were doing that you had to change in order to get better?
Yeah, I think that I was often thinking of discrete incidents. Like this happens and then this happens and then this happens, as though have you ever sewn anything?
I mean, maybe in school or something, or
Have you
like a
have you
cat.
ever have you ever tried to like tie a knot on like a piece of string?
Yeah, sure.
And so if you're threading a needle, you need the knot to be a certain size so that the thread doesn't go through and you can actually like sew your clothes or whatever, right? And this is like weirdly hard because if you tie two knots, to get them to land on top of each other is like not the easiest thing to do. So I think I was plotting like having a string with a bunch of different knots spaced at like weird spaces from each other, none of them on top of each other. And I think that like now I'm like mixing my metaphors horribly, but I'm going to do it
It's
anyway.
okay. That's what
But
this
like,
show's for.
but like the math has to carry forward. Like if, I don't know, Naranjan's death, which I've already talked about, is like a good example. Like he dies pretty early in the book, and like that death has to carry forward for the whole rest of the book. Like people cannot forget that he died. They can't forget him because they wouldn't have
Right.
forgotten. And
Right.
like they would be making their choices in the shadow of that plot point. So it's not like what happened. Like my former colleague Charlie Baxter, I guess, would call these one-way gates, right? And so I think what I was really learning was the value of the one-way gate, that like he dies and there's no going back, and like everyone is different forever after that point.
I want to just say, the thing that just occurred to me as you were saying this is the phrase slowing down. Like once something like that happens, maybe part of the creative process afterwards for a writer who's trying to be good at plot is to make sure to slow down and really deeply consider uh, all these like all these previous choices and their impacts. You know what I'm saying? Like it just, there's inherent complexity to it, and maybe when a book is bad at plot, it isn't paying homage to that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, like
I don't know.
Charlie talks about Captain Happen, and then I invented like my version, which is Captain Consequence, who's like Captain Happen's friend who's like running along behind him trying to catch up or something.
Right.
And like I like when you have the big event happen, there has to be the aftermath, and like the debris of
And,
of the explosion.
and also, just I think a certain, maybe really good writing, there's a certain psychological and emotional intelligence at work, because not everything that a character is going to do in the aftermath, say, of a deep loss is going to be explicit, as like an explicit reaction to that loss. It could be something totally at a remove, like 6, 10, 12 degrees of remove from that event, but the way in which the character responds will carry within it that deep loss. Do you know what I'm saying? I feel like maybe
Yeah,
it's like some subconscious thing that's happening, but that makes a certain sense to me.
yeah, I think that that's exactly right. And I mean, it was funny because I think I had realized it kind of early in the plotting, and then Whitney, my podcast co-host, had read a draft of this novel for me, and he totally called me on. There was an incident that like Sashi sees something very violent, and then there was no consequence for it, and he was like, Sugi, like, wouldn't she tell someone about that? And I was like, oh right, I have an emotional logic problem. Like, right, it's like she's a like, how could she have seen that and not said anything
Was
to
this on the
anyone?
side of the road? I don't want to spoil it. Was this the side of the road? Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Good choice, Whitney. Credit for catching
he's a
that.
great reader.
Yeah,
um yeah,
that
so
make
I mean, just like the emotional logic of that world, like if you saw that, you would say something to someone, you would need to process it in some way.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so like just to review, it's about cause and effect and carrying forward. It's about what did you call it? Happen. Mr. Hap,
Charlie
Captain.
calls it Captain Happen, like that you have a character who like makes things happen.
Yeah.
That's Captain Happen. And then I made up Captain Consequence when I was talking to my students like last year. I was like, where's your cat? Like who's the person who's like, man, I don't know. Is there a way you can manifest like the consequence for the people? Like what is, yeah, Captain Consequence. It's not as well formed as Charlie.
I like it though. I like this image of him like running to keep up. So I want to talk to you about Sashi a little bit, because another aspect of this book, which I've mentioned briefly that I love so much, is her aspiration to be a doctor. And I cannot think of anything that I've ever read that idealizes and articulates the highest aspiration of anybody entering the medical profession better than this book. Like it moved me. I'm not a doctor. Like you know what I'm saying? I have, in case you didn't know, I am not a surgeon or any of this, and I have mixed feelings about the medical profession, and just the medical system in this country in particular. It can often leave me wanting, and I can feel like the highest aspirations of Sashi are what I want so badly from the doctors I come into contact with, and I don't always feel it. It's like this feeling in America where it's like, okay, I've got 7 minutes, like, let me give you your physical and push you out the door and charge you $400. It's like, whoa, and she is someone who is so kind-hearted and just good at her core and wants to heal people, regardless of their politics, regardless of their gender, regardless of their, nationality, whatever it is. She is just a helper. And I love that about it. I like flagged multiple passages where she's talking about her love of medicine. And I found myself wondering, like, wow, is Sugi like super, is there like some like unrealized aspiration? Did you want to be a doctor, but it never happened? Or no? Because you write so well about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not a doctor. I just play one in this novel, but I feel like I am fortunate to know a lot of physicians, and I think, as in a lot of other communities, I think the profession of physician is accorded like a significant and distinctive respect. I mean, sometimes in problematic ways, but in other ways, like ways that make a lot of sense to me. I think I've been fortunate to know a lot of doctors who are Sashi-like, in their intent and care, their conscientiousness, their generosity. And so that was them. And a lot of those people were, and my father, I should say, is one of them. And so the doctors that I knew were sometimes people that I was calling up and saying, like, is this medically plausible? And, and of course I did also my internet research, sometimes, and there's definitely like, I'm also just a person who's watched a lot of medical TV shows. I don't know, but
yeah.
I was
listen,
trying to.
If your dad's a doctor, I think people who grow up with a family member who's a physician. I just talked to Ayobami Adebayo, and she has a character in her book who's a doctor and wrote so well about it to the point where I was like, whoa. And then she's like, yeah, my mom and like 2 of my siblings are doctors, and I basically grew up in a hospital. So I was like, oh, okay.
I find them so comforting.
Uh-huh.
Like the hospital.
Listen,
hospital.
while I'm, I'd love an ER, like nothing better than an emergency room. But while I'm talking with you about this, I feel like I want to read a passage, if I may. I'm going to read to you this passage from your book. It's actually late in the book, but it gets to the beauty of the writing about Sashi as a doctor / healer. And it gets to, I think, her conception of what that means. She says, I held the pieces of her earlobe together and tried to make the stitches small. She was right. Doctors resolve to relieve pain, but pain is information, and to lose it can mean losing something valuable. Pain draws a map, and if your body hurts, then your mind is occupied and cannot think too deeply about what has happened to you. I was trying not only to ease her pain, but also to make her scar as small as possible. It should have been obvious to me that she no longer cared about the evidence of damage, but perhaps that was part of my job, to care on her behalf. That's lovely.
Thank you.
Like, I want a doctor like Sashi. Like, we all doctors should be like this, but it's also just very intelligent, the way that pain is information, pain draws a map, the way that patients, especially in situations like this, can often not have the wherewithal to advocate for themselves. They could be in mental states that are, not the greatest, shall we say. And it's the doctor's responsibility to step in that case. And unless there's a family member, I guess, who could do it. But, if it's just you and the patient, then it sort of is your responsibility to care where maybe the patient does not care or cannot care. So I just hadn't thought about it that way. But your book has many moments that kind of draw the medical profession in this very deep and thoughtful way.
Thank you.
I love that.
I think it's a description in some ways of shock, that paragraph. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I have been fortunate to talk to some medical humanities people in the wake of the publication of this book, and that has been particularly interesting.
Have they responded well?
Yeah, I mean, so I think they told me that. I mean, I don't think I made any glaring medical errors, for example.
Yeah.
But I also think that, I think hopefully it's about medicine in a way that is useful.
Totally. And I'm wondering too about the reaction from the Tamil diaspora, like readers from the Tamil diaspora, or people. I don't know if people in Sri Lanka have reached out to you. Have you gotten feedback on the book that's been meaningful or interesting or surprising in any way?
I have. I guess the book came out January 3rd, and we're talking sort of close to the end of February. The book comes out in the UK and kind of the former British Commonwealth the end of June. So Sri Lanka, India, I think it's available there now as an ebook and as an audiobook. So people are starting to finish it, and I have gotten some really kind notes from folks who think I got things right, which means a lot to me because, as we've discussed, I did not grow up in Jaffna. I am not a doctor, and so none of the details come from my personal history in an obvious way. And so I think that particularly to hear from people who are connected to Jaffna that they feel that I have captured that place is very meaningful to hear.
I mean, listen, I'm about as far from an expert on all this as you can get, but coming away from this book, I have to believe that this book will be received and remembered as a very meaningful contribution to Sri Lankan Civil War literature, fiction and non. I have to believe. I mean, I would hope anyway. I'm such a fan of it, and it gave me such a great education. As I've said, I think you'll hear that from a lot of readers, no doubt. And such a moving book. I was so invested in these people and was, like I said, I have not rooted as hard for a protagonist as I was rooting for Sashi. I mean, I was practically doing cheers.
Thank you. She needed them.
Yeah, she did. But, wonderful, wonderful novel. And I always ask people what they're working on. It's like the rudest question. It's like, okay, so you got this one done. What's next? It feels especially rude considering this book took you 20 years to now be like, all right, let's go, Sugi. You're on the clock. But sometimes writers have things going, simultaneously, right? So maybe you have another book in the works.
I am sort of wrestling with this because I think some part of me does feel like I should put my nose to the grindstone immediately. And then there are people in my life who have indicated that I should take a break. I am interested in, I think I have sort of a very nascent short story collection-ish, and maybe also a very nascent essay collection-ish, some of which, that has material that has been published, say, in journals and stuff before, and that might sort of lend itself to some sort of coherence. I guess I have to figure out what coherence looks like in those forms to me, because those are not forms I've tried yet. I
want to interrupt because something I meant to ask, but I almost forgot, and I'm glad that I didn't, is the fact that in 2021, you lost the use of your hands. Mm-hmm. So for a writer, for anyone, this is difficult. But for a writer, who is presumably typing, as most of us do these days, that's difficult. I'm wondering if that has impacted your ability to work. Has the use come back at all? Like, where are things with regard to that? And can you give listeners maybe just a brief, like, thumbnail of what happened so they understand?
Yeah. The quickest way to describe it is just pandemic overuse injuries to both arms that sort of first manifested in April 21 and have pretty consistently limited the use of my hands and arms for mostly like daily simple tasks ever since. And there were moments when it was bad enough that you'd be like, oh, I'll take a sip of this coffee very quickly and put the mug down again. And it's kind of like not a lot of door opening that I'm interested in doing, etc. And some of it's just like, if you're at home more, there's like twice as many dishes at home. And I don't know, like, so lots of little things kind of accumulating to put stress on my arms in ways that, so it's like a bunch of different injuries that have sort of compounded. And there have been various points where it's improved. Maybe like a month and a half ago was actually pretty good. And then I got kind of complacent and overconfident and did a bunch of regular things and then flared myself right back up again.
So it's an inflammation issue? Like it's
some of it. Like I have bone spurs, but I also have like just sort of like a lot of tendinitis and swelling. And so like I have tennis elbow and golfer's elbow in both arms, and then the bone spurs. And then I had an impinged nerve at one point. So like a lot of it is inflammation. And sometimes like you can't really tell what it came from.
Sure.
And like at this point, I have no idea what my arms look like at a pre-swelling size. Like so sometimes I can't tell. So I just have tried to kind of, figure out ergonomic ways to do things or alternative habits. Or so I walk my dog with a waist leash and I don't pick her up no matter how cute she looks. That's not true. I totally pick her up, and sometimes that's what flares up my arms. I'm a sucker for her. I used to play tennis. I played the saxophone, past tense. I never really liked driving, and now I deeply hate it. And I can't really ride a bicycle for very long. So there's a lot of limitations, and typing is one of them. And I think that I had known, but not understood the way that the motion of your fingers on the keyboard is intimately connected to your thoughts untangling themselves. And now I have to untangle my thoughts a different way sometimes, because typing is definitely a thing that causes inflammation.
So you finished Brotherless Night using voice recognition software, right? You talked it out or no?
Yeah, especially at the end. A significant part of the book was like there were scenes that I wrote using voice recognition, and then the University of Minnesota accommodated me in part by assigning scribes to work with me. Voice recognition software is great at composition, or can be decent at least at composition, and it's really bad at revision.
Sure.
So the students did revision with me. So I started reading the book aloud to one of them to go through my proofs, and that was really useful. That cleaned up my sentences.
Well, something that you pointed out, I think you talked about this in an interview about voice recognition software. Obviously not the ideal set of circumstances for a writer used to typing, but one thing that it does help you with is it prevents you from procrastinating maybe as easily as you could. That made a certain sense to me when you said it. I was like, oh yeah, like if you're using voice recognition software, it's harder to like break away from the text and go to Twitter because you have to hear yourself say it.
Yes. Yeah.
Like Siri, whatever it is, but
yeah,
it enforces a certain accountability.
You have to narrate your fucking around.
Right. Maybe I should try that then. Maybe it might be time for me. So anyway, for the next project that you do you anticipate that you will be typing it, or do you anticipate that you'll be using voice for the early drafting?
I'll probably have to use voice for at least some of the early drafting. Probably like sometimes it's kind of a percentage thing to kind of make sure that it just rests enough. But I would guess that 50% at least will have to be voice recognition.
That's a little bit different of
It
a
is different.
creative process, right? I mean, I read my stuff aloud in this like weird mumbly voice. Like, you know how you're supposed to read your stuff aloud,
Yes.
especially in like revision. I do that. I think it helps to hear it. But what I find when I'm reading is that like I start to go into a trance, and I do this like weird, weird voice that like my son caught me doing. Like he was napping, and then I was working next to him, and then he woke up, and I was like doing it. And he's like, "Dad, what are you doing?" you know, and I was like, but anyway, I'm just wondering like the differences, like to talk it out like that might have some benefits, but it might also have some negatives. Like what's been your experience of it, just out of curiosity, like in terms of what it yields?
I mean, I think that there's of course a ton of self-consciousness. It makes a difference if there's another person there in both good and bad ways. I think for composition, it can be really difficult to have another person present, even in electronic or virtual space. And for revision, I found it to be really useful because then I wasn't kind of just doing the like mumbly, skippy thing.
Yeah.
But I was like, I don't know, I was reading like I was like a tiny podium in my brain or something, like because I had an audience.
I was gonna say it's like a performance almost, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just in the same way I would have had to narrate my screwing around. I was really reading to someone who was really listening. And so I think it's harder for me too. Like if there's not someone there like, to read my work aloud to just myself. But you know, I don't know. Like, what does that mean that people should do? Like, hire someone to listen to them?
Right.
Maybe, I don't know. I
Maybe.
guess if you had the resources, or just like, because like most people, I mean, I don't know. Say your spouse is your first reader, you'd have to get I don't know, them to sit there and listen while you read the whole book.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a big ask.
A lot.
Even
Yeah.
for a spouse, maybe especially for a spouse.
It's a big ask.
Yeah.
It's a really big ask. So I don't know how one gets around that. Like maybe you find the friend who loves audiobooks and you like offer to be on the phone with them in their car every time they're commuting.
I could record. I mean, you know, you could record. You've got a microphone. I guess you could record it and make a little audiobook for them. But
I don't think that would work as well, because I think the thing that helped me a lot was like the real-time reaction. Like I would read a sentence,
right.
and then I would be like, that's a bad sentence.
Yeah.
Like, or I repeated a word and I didn't realize before that I had done that. And then I was lucky because like the scribe in particular, I mean, both of them have good instincts, and like I would ask their opinions and they would be honest about them. And like I read most of the book to one of them, and they kept track of continuity and things like that. I'd be like, was this clear to you? Like, do you remember that this other thing happened earlier? Like, this word here is supposed to indicate this. Did you get that call back? It's like a kind of really close reading.
Yeah. So maybe that's the thing. Like, I mean, you got to sort of play the hand you're dealt, right? When it comes to health stuff. And maybe, you know, it's a bummer in some ways, but in other ways, maybe it's helping to give you insights that you might not have otherwise, or like a sensitivity to audience. That's always something I struggle with, you know.
I think in the case of that particular reading aloud, it was a huge advantage.
Yeah. Well, I loved this novel, and
Thank
I don't like, you know, I get a little bit skittish around like book review culture and the way they toss around words. So I will say that this book feels masterpiecey, if that's a way of putting it. It feels that way to me. Like it just feels like a book that just said everything that it wanted to say, and just line by line got it right. And it was just it worked so well at so many different levels. I don't know. It felt like a beautiful achievement to me. And I have been recommending it to people. So I applaud you for the effort and the endurance that it took, not only over the time and then in response in real time to history, but also dealing with health stuff. I mean, all the stuff that you had to go through to get this thing done. And now here you are, and it's about to drop in the UK, and you're going to be a global phenomenon. I mean, I hope you're ready for this.
Brad, thank you so much. That's all so generous. And also there's who knows? And there's so many wonderful books out there. And
but this is one of them. This is one.
I
of
really
them.
appreciate that. I really appreciate that.
Hey, it's a great book. I read a lot of books. This is a great book, and it's a big achievement. And You should be proud of it. And I will look forward to whatever you come up with next. I wish you well, health-wise and creatively. And thank you for taking all this time to talk with me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And good luck with all of your creative endeavors.